Hello and Ram Ram. Welcome to the fourth video in the India Way Explained series. Today we cover the fourth chapter, the Dogmas of Delhi. This chapter is long but interesting and easy to digest. If you're someone who likes history, you will find this video a lot more interesting than the other ones. Regardless, it is an important chapter because it stitches together important events that molded Indian foreign policy into what it is today, into a foundation one can use to further analyze India's relationship with the world. I won't bore you much longer. As always, if you enjoy my videos or find them helpful, hit the like and subscribe button. On to the video. The world is changing and many of the beliefs long held to be true are no longer valid. There is a need to think, talk and engage differently in this new world. Simply falling back on the past is not going to help in being prepared for the future. The very structure of the current international order is undergoing an intense transformation. Three examples of this change are extremely visible: American nationalism, China's rise, Brexit, and the rebalancing of the global economy. Some other examples of this phenomenon include return of old empires in Russia, Iran, or Turkey via an exercise of their influence in regions close to them, West Asia seeing turbulence even by its highly volatile standards, ASEAN no longer being as central to Asia as it once was, the importance of Africa due to demographic and economic trends, and South America becoming a battleground of ideas once more. What defines power and determines national standing have also changed. Technology, connectivity and trade are now at the center of new disputes. Competition has been forced into becoming more intelligent in nature due to how constrained and interdependent our world has become. Disagreements over global commons are going to rise as multilateralism weakens. Climate change will mean an opening of an Arctic passage, thereby adding to geopolitical tension. The corona pandemic caught countries completely off guard. All in all, the change that we are living through is extraordinary. Quick crude explainers: global commons usually refers to natural systems and resources like the atmosphere or oceans that do not belong to any one country. Multilateralism refers to cooperation between multiple states, usually three or more, via an arrangement or institution. As the landscape of the world today has changed, so too have India's key partners. US and China are more relevant to India than ever. The Russian relationship continues to remain steady despite the odds. Japan has become important to Indian calculations. France is a critical strategic partner. Europe as a whole continues to be rediscovered. Bridges to the Gulf countries have been built, making the sense of extended neighborhood stronger. Outreach via diplomatic activities now extends from quote South America and the Caribbean to the South Pacific and Baltics, end quote. In the more immediate neighborhood, the consequences of unprecedented investment are being felt. When seen together, the scale and intensity of Indian global engagement is such that it would be difficult to recognize even for those who have been engaged in this business for a while now. As issues and relationships change, so too will the process of reasoning to support them. In such a situation, it is important to avoid obsessing over consistency, as it makes little sense when the circumstances are constantly changing. Constants are important, but one should avoid holding them as unchangeable concepts. The reality is that only by recognizing change can Indians position themselves to exploit opportunities. A determined pursuit of national interests must always be the norm, no matter how challenging the global dynamics are. Prejudices, an opinion not based on reason or actual experience, and preconceptions, an idea formed before having the evidence for its truth or usefulness, cannot be allowed to stand in the way of such an exercise. Quote, "The real obstacle to the rise of India is not any more the barriers of the world, but the dogmas of Delhi," end quote. The ability to respond to a variety of situations is a part of a nation's rise. Those who aim to induce change run into the accumulated wisdom of the entrenched class or the passionate reasoning of the polarized one. Adding to this is the Indian obsession with words and text, forms and processes often seen as more important than outcomes. Political change is fortunately helping in challenging past practices and frozen narratives. This is done by taking into account India's determined striving to expand space and options. This is not an end in itself. It is meant to ensure, quote, greater prosperity at home, peace on the borders, protection of our people, and enhancing influence abroad, end quote. India's national strategy of achieving constant goals that remain the same over a period of time, cannot be a static one because the world itself is evolving. This is not something new for Indians, given that the country has witnessed the world move from bipolarity to unipolarity to multipolarity. Changes in strategy must address the need for greater capabilities, ambitions, responsibilities, and most importantly, changing circumstances. A regular revisitation of assumptions and a revision of calculations is important. To achieve this, an accurate reading of history is pivotal. How does this help? It helps us appreciate why India must respond to the global environment in different ways rather than apply doctrines and concepts in a mechanical fashion. When India has made practical and realistic assessments of contemporary geopolitics and broken with its own past when the need arrived, it has advanced its interests effectively. The 1971 Bangladesh War, the 1992 economic and political repositioning, the 1998 nuclear tests, and the 2005 India-US nuclear deal are some examples. India has achieved decisive shifts in its favor through a series of disruptions. In contrast to this, India's attempts at charting a consistent course even in the midst of changing circumstances has led to undesirable outcomes. Let's look at two examples. The first is the Indo-Chinese relationship of the 1950s. India chose to engage China as part of a larger post-colonial front, even though Tibet and the boundary dispute caused political differences to intensify. The second and more obvious example is that of India's engagement with Pakistan, even as Pakistan increasingly resorted to terrorism. To a degree, this is a debate about realism and hard security. It suggests the need for an unsentimental audit of Indian foreign policy. What does such an unsentimental audit look like? One of India's dark moments was the 1962 defeat to China. Another almost dark one was the 1965 war with Pakistan, where the outcome remained uncertain until the very end. India also has its moments of triumphs, the most famous one being the 1971 war, where victory led to the creation of Bangladesh. A misreading of geopolitics and economics up to 1991 is contrasted by the reformist policies that followed it. Nuclear indecision spanning 2 decades ended dramatically with the 1998 nuclear tests. The lack of response to the attacks of 26/11 is contrasted by the tit-for-tat measures that were the Uri and Balakot operations. Events and trends are worth observing critically due to the lessons they hold. When looking back at the journey India has made since independence, we must be careful in ensuring that a growth in our capabilities and influence doesn't conceal our missed chances and shortcomings. While thinking of the roads not taken is often an exercise in imagination, they are also a sign of honest introspection. A power that takes self-improvement seriously should not back away from undertaking such an activity. Understanding India's foreign policy evolution since independence is best done by dividing the evolution into 6 phases and seeing each one as a response to a different strategic environment. Phase 1, 1946 to 1962. This phase is best characterized as an era of optimistic non-alignment. The setting was a bipolar world, with the US and USSR forming the 2 major poles. India's objectives in this era were to resist the restriction of its choices, the dilution of its sovereignty as it sought to rebuild its economy, and consolidate its unity. A parallel goal of this era was to lead Asia and Africa in building a more equitable world order by virtue of being the first of the decolonized nations. Quote, "This was the heyday of Bandung and Belgrade, the peak of Third World solidarity. It also saw energetic Indian diplomacy from Korea and Vietnam to Suez and Hungary." End quote. India's position on the world stage had seemed assured. Then 1962 happened. The conflict with China not only brought an end to this period but also significantly damaged India's standing. Phase 2, 1962 to 1971, the decade of realism and recovery. India's choices on security and political challenges were pragmatic in nature, even as it addressed a lack of resources. External pressure on Kashmir, especially from the US and UK, intensified in this period of vulnerability. In the interest of national security, India looked beyond non-alignment. It concluded a now largely forgotten defense understanding with the US in 1964. The setting for the world was still bipolar in nature, with a change in the form of limited US and USSR cooperation. South Asia was an area of convergence for them, and Indian diplomacy found itself facing down the superpowers together at places like Tashkent in 1966. Domestic challenges in this period were severe, ranging from political turbulence to economic distress. What is important to note, however, is that even with the heightened stress levels, India emerged from this phase without great damage being dealt to it. Phase 3, 1971 to 1991, the time of greater regional assertion by India. The phase began with the end of the Indo-Pakistan equivalence due to the creation of Bangladesh, but ended with the IPKF misadventure in Sri Lanka. The global setting was dramatically different from the earlier phases. The Sino-US rapprochement of 1971 upended the strategic landscape. India's response was the Indo-Soviet Treaty and the adoption of a more pro-Soviet position on international issues. This phase was particularly complex due to the threat posed to India by the US-China-Pakistan axis that had come into being. The collapse of the USSR and the economic crisis in 1991 compelled India to pivot its domestic and foreign policy once more. Phase 4. This phase is characterized by the dissolution of the USSR and emergence of the unipolar world. India radically rethought its position on a whole range of issues as it shifted its focus towards safeguarding its strategic autonomy. India's economic opening up to the world accompanied new diplomatic priorities and approaches. The Look East policy and adjustments on its position when it came to Israel summarized this changed position on world affairs. India began reaching out and engaging the US more intensively during this period, but it did this while protecting its hold over critical sectors. Trade negotiations and securing its nuclear weapon became the focus of India as it aimed to strengthen its strategic autonomy. Come the turn of the century, India had done enough to shift gears and move up. It was a declared nuclear weapon power after 1998. It defeated Pakistan at Kargil in 1999. It induced global interest with its economic growth and managed the relationship with the US well at a time when the US was, quote, focusing more on developments in Asia and the consequences of Islamic fundamentalism, end quote. As the US found it difficult to maintain the same degree of unipolarity over the passing years, the new competitive environment created new opportunities for India. A consequence of this was that India discovered the benefits of working on different issues with different powers. Phase 5. India acquires the attributes of a balancing power. India's relevance to the world and its ability to influence outcomes became greater in this era. The Indo-US nuclear deal, as well as a better understanding with the West, is evidence of this. In this phase, India also made common cause with China when it came to climate change and trade. India strengthened ties with Russia and helped fashion BRICS into a major forum. This phase was once again a period of opportunity where, quote, India moved the global needle by taking new positions, end quote. Phase 6, 2014 onwards. A number of developments converged to change calculations in this phase. China gathered more momentum, and as a result, the terms of engagement it offered the world became more unpalatable. Periods of transition offer the best environment for balancing, and as new realities took root, it inevitably weakened. At the other extreme, the US started to sound uncertain. The risk aversion felt in the aftermath of the Iraq War intensified US resource limitation. The Afghan withdrawal and, quote, displaying growing tepidity in the Asia-Pacific, end quote, sent out a message that had an impact well beyond immediate issues. Europe turned inwards, failing to appreciate that political agnosticism would extract its own cost. Japan's efforts to have more of a say in the world continued to unfold only gradually. The full impact of the 2008 financial crisis and global economic rebalancing made its presence felt in a variety of ways. The world saw a dispersal of power and more localized equations, well and truly proclaiming the arrival of multipolarity. India chose energetic diplomacy in the face of these new developments and the state of global regimes and coalitions, and understanding that the world has moved on to convergences and issue-based arrangements as well as a growth of the country's capabilities accompanied this. All of this has brought out the limitations of other powers and expectations the world has of India. The emergence of India as a major economy and the relevance of Indian talent to global technology have played key roles in this. India now has the ability to shoulder greater responsibility at a time when other powers aren't willing to step in and do so. It is more willing to influence global negotiations such as on climate change. India has invested more in development partnerships with countries of the South. Its approach to its immediate and extended neighborhood has resonated well beyond these geographies. The 6 phases have their highs and lows. The ending of one can be seen as the beginning of the other. The 1971 Bangladesh War and the 1998 nuclear tests can be classed as our highs. The 1962 war with China, or a combination of events such as the Gulf War, the breakup of the USSR, economic stagnation, and domestic turbulence of 1991 can be seen as lows. These lows are perhaps more responsible in a direct way for significant changes of India's journey. While it is important to not have rigid or entrenched opinions about the past, it is also crucial to not be dismissive of it. This is because Indian policy shows both strains of continuity from the past as well as changes from the past. On a conceptual level, one could visualize each phase as being overlaid on the previous one, rather than a negotiation or extrapolation between the phases. Quote, thus, the independent mindset that drove non-alignment and then protected our strategic equities can today be better expressed in multiple partnerships. End quote. 70 years of foreign policy offer a lot of lessons as India contemplates upon the challenging road ahead. It spans a broad spectrum in terms of time and outcomes. An honest assessment tells us that while some of India's competitors have done better in terms of performance, India itself has not done too shabbily. India has overcome many challenges in order to strengthen its national unity and integrity. This is remarkable considering that other diverse societies such as the USSR and Yugoslavia have not survived into the present day. A modern economy with industrial capacities and lesser reliance on nature in our agriculture has developed over time. Defense preparedness has improved. Indian diplomacy has helped the country access multiple sources of equipment and technology. Despite all this, India's borders remain unsettled even after 7 decades of independence. India's performance in the economic sphere looks good when the comparison is with India's own past. When compared to China or Southeast Asia, things change. It is necessary to develop a strong awareness of the country's performance. An evaluation set in the right context is helpful in building this awareness. It is useful to understand what non-alignment was about given the fierce streak of independence that runs through India's policy evolution. Until the War of 1962, Indian efforts were aimed at getting the best deal possible from both camps of the Cold War. It succeeded in obtaining economic and food assistance from the West and collaborated on industrialization with the Soviets. For security needs, India approached both camps with some success, with the USSR eventually providing adequate capabilities. China too attempted to walk a similar path, albeit in a different way that saw greater ambition and less consistency. The steadiness of India's approach contrasted the disruptiveness of China's. It is an open question if one could have adopted the approach of the other. Quote, perhaps there were statements of their character. End quote. The middle path in this area was not just a simple policy choice for India. It also reflected contradictory structural pulls. When it came to the West, India was bound by a broad network of post-colonial linkages that spanned economic, social and political realms. The pressures of the Cold War prevented excessive closeness, however. With the USSR, the planned economy model and industrial aspirations generated much enthusiasm. This was balanced by India's pluralistic political beliefs. As India went about strengthening its national integration, it saw both camps serve its interests at different points in time. They helped expand the country's political space at a time when many nations were regaining their freedom. This afforded India the opportunity to its own constituency and brand through the 1950s. Broad concepts are not easy to translate into policy, interests and outcomes. Non-alignment is no exception. With the West, India's engagement was heavily Eurocentric and failed to adequately cater for the new American primacy that was emerging. This stood in contrast to the determined cultivation of the US by Pakistan's elite. Indian differences with Pakistan on larger global issues played a role in the solidification of US support for Pakistan, reaching a point where Pakistan gained tactical superiority versus India in 1965. On the other hand, the political opening with the USSR proved fruitful in the form of support in the United Nations on Jammu and Kashmir. Defense ties took more time to develop. The USSR's ideological links with China continued even when the relationship between the two was under strain, thereby limiting its role in the events of 1962. It is also interesting to note that non-alignment impacted the bilateral-multilateral balance of Indian diplomacy. Aiming to acquire a global profile came at the cost of limiting national interests. The exercise in increasing international influence eventually ended up being a fatal diversion. Quote, the commitment of key players to UN duty in 1960 during Nehru's visit to Pakistan and again in 1962 as the China front deteriorated spoke volumes on Indian priorities. End quote. The moment of truth was the 1962 conflict. India's inadequacy when it came to understanding power was revealed in the preparation for and actual conduct during the war. There exists a tendency to assume the events in the period leading up to 1962 were predestined, determined in advance by divine will or fate. This in order to mitigate responsibility for the policy disaster created by those sitting at the highest levels. A narrative of betrayal was designed. It took such deep root that the demonization of China that followed has hampered an objective analysis of the Indo-Chinese relationship of this period. Quote, independent of the justification for the boundary claims, there are some issues that need to be addressed in the context of India's larger posture vis-a-vis China. End quote. There was a genuine debate within the Indian system over whether in the aftermath of the 1950 Chinese invasion of Tibet, India should have initiated steps to finalize what had become a common border. This isn't a completely hypothetical issue given that serious suggestions to this end were made by extremely senior policymakers. The famous letter written to Prime Minister Nehru by Sardar Patel was part of this discourse. Quote, however, in what presumably was a desire to avoid immediate friction, the decision was made to postpone such engagement. End quote. At the time this decision was made, China was isolated internationally and its own position on Tibet had not hardened till 1959. The point in recounting all this is to tease out the fact that there exists a tendency to postpone difficult issues. To any non-Indians watching, postpone means delay. Avoiding making hard choices was true when it came to the development of the nuclear option as well. It is this same mindset that during the 1962 conflict led to the limited involvement of the military leadership in the decision-making process to catastrophic consequences. Quote, "At the first sign of setback, we turn to others for both advice and assistance." End quote. For a full decade following 1962, India made a pragmatic comeback, even if the ground retrieved was only partial. On the domestic front, India aimed to overcome the shock of its 1962 defeat and resisted territorial concessions to Pakistan in Jammu and Kashmir as the price for Western assistance. Economic distress resulting from a failed monsoon was made worse due to political instability, including succession processes. Domestic political agitations spanning Tamil Nadu to Punjab undid the message of stability achieved in the first years of independence. India was seen to have entered a dangerous decade. The world may have been bipolar, but the two superpowers shared an interest in checking China. India became one of the focal points of this endeavor. The Cultural Revolution meant the front with China stabilized, but the Pakistani front became increasingly dangerous, culminating in the 1965 war. The two superpowers forced India into a difficult compromise at Tashkent. A Soviet overture to Pakistan was made as US pressure on India mounted over the Vietnam question. Quote, "This period came to a head with two extraordinary events of realism that were cause and consequence." End quote. The first event, the cause, was the Sino-US rapprochement of 1971, facilitated by Pakistan and altering the global strategic scenario at a fundamental level. The second event, the consequence, was the Indo-Soviet Treaty, a response by the two parties most directly affected by the first event. For India, this represented a compromise between non-alignment and strategic security. The decisions of the Pakistani leadership that eventually led to conflict with India in 1971 being the trigger. It is tempting to speculate if India would have taken such a tough call in the earlier, more exciting days of international diplomacy. Regardless, it remains a fact that the victory of India in the War of 1971 represented a partial recovery from the reverses of 1962. By breaking the equivalence between India and Pakistan, India ushered in a phase of greater regionalism. This period should be valued for countering the pre-1962 tendency, perhaps more than the outcomes it produced. The willingness of India to expand the conflict beyond Jammu and Kashmir in the 1965 war is an example of this. Pakistan had failed in adequately preparing for such a scenario. They also failed to adequately prepare for a scenario where India would stand its ground despite the advantage of superior arms Pakistan enjoyed. The military was given a greater say in the wars of 1965 and 1971, as well as the Nathula clashes of 1967, leading to better outcomes at the end. The War of 1971 also saw better strategizing when it came to war preparations, including the signing of the Indo-USSR Treaty, seen then as a radical measure. So what lessons do these contrasting periods offer India today? Better integration within India's national security system and thinking through the response to an unavoidable challenge. A new phase began in the aftermath of the 1971 victory. The division of Pakistan had far-reaching consequences. The half-hearted attempts made by the US and China to assist Pakistan during the war had the unintended impact of adding prestige to India's standing. It is in the nature of a power to steadily widen its horizons over time, and India was no exception to this post-1971. It did not take long for it to attempt an improvement in ties with the US, something that led to Henry Kissinger, the then United States Secretary of State, their foreign minister, visiting India in 1973. Kissinger knew that this was an attempt at restoring the balance following the events of 1971. This is one reason why the US response to India's nuclear test of 1974 was surprisingly sober. It was a lot more difficult to send back an ambassador to China in 1976 after a gap of 15 years. Both these diplomatic events can be seen as India expanding its options. The widening of horizons was visible in the effort at creating a third option in Europe via the acquisition of Jaguars, Mirages and HDW submarine. More evidence for this widening could be seen in the prime ministerial visits to the US in 1982 and 1985, as well as the tentative resumption of defense cooperation involving the light combat aircraft. Boundary talks with China resumed in 1981 and reached a point of leadership level discussions in 1988. The immediate neighborhood felt the real impact of India's enhanced stature in this phase. Pakistan was the most important challenge, and India chose to be generous to it at Shimla in 1972. A natural desire to influence the direction of Pakistan as well as pressure from the US and USSR contributed to this decision. Contemporary observers were surprised at this outcome given the cards India held. It took some time for the negative implications of such a move to unfold. But even as this happened, India's assertion of its interests was much more forceful than ever before. A growing concern over the Siachen glacier was dealt with successfully. In Sri Lanka, there was an attempt to quell a brewing ethnic conflict via a settlement guaranteed by India. Even though the initiative went awry, that it was ever undertaken in the first place showed growing confidence. India responded to mercenaries attacking Maldives by sending in its troops in consultation with other powers. A diplomatic campaign to limit the presence of extra-regional navies in the Indian Ocean was also undertaken. South Asia or China, India moved to defend its interests in national security. The overall picture of India was that of a rising regional power that was protective of its interests while hopeful about creating a receptive neighborhood. Not everything went India's way during this period. The gains of 1971 were significantly undone by the assassination of Sheikh Mujib in Dhaka in August 1975. Pakistan's mobilization of the Islamic world combined with the Cold War politics of the era blocked India at the Security Council elections of 1975. China's invasion of Vietnam in 1979 played a role in undermining a serious overture in the making and halted corrections in India's foreign policy. The Soviet-Afghan War saw the US unleash a new round of American military support for Pakistan. This proved particularly calamitous to India as it tapped into a, quote, larger Islamic fundamentalist resurgence, end quote. Sino-Pakistani collaboration increased after a lull due to China's preoccupation with the Cultural Revolution. It had three key elements: a physical link via the Karakoram Highway in 1979, intense nuclear and missile collaboration, and coordination on operations in Afghanistan. The impact of this is felt in India to this day. China's decision to change its position on the boundary dispute negotiations in the eastern sector was almost as significant. The Khalistan movement found fertile ground due to renewed enmity emanating from Pakistan and hostility by the West over the Soviet-Afghan War. When it came to support, India was stuck with the USSR that found itself mired in Afghanistan. A no-win situation in every scenario. As the USSR faced pressure at the same time as India, the two countries found themselves growing ever closer to each other. For India, what started off as an effective exploitation of a global contradiction ended in an impasse. The 1980s offer more insight than the 1960s due to the transformational events it saw. There are three that deserve special attention. Quote, Afghanistan as a reading of global politics, Sri Lanka as the challenge of boots on the ground, and China as the benefit of playing contradictions, end quote. The most consequential of these was the Afghan Jihad. India misjudged the extent to which Western countries would utilize it to damage the USSR. The intensity of their support allowed Pakistan a window to push ahead with its nuclear program. There is some merit in arguing that India could do little even if it read the situation better. It took a full generation to move on from the consequences of these events. In the present, there is some satisfaction in seeing Western countries haunted by the first jihad. Quote, "The strategic damage of this period is difficult to overstate. As for its catastrophic impact on the USSR, this was truly a black swan, one not foreseen even by the most experienced analysts of that era." End quote. The peacekeeping intervention in Sri Lanka has received less attention than it deserves. The fundamental question raised is that of the deployment of boots on the ground in foreign lands. The US had been singed with a similar experience in Lebanon just a few years before the intervention. Blame can be divided many different ways: limited comprehension of local attitudes and interests, lack of preparation, paucity of intelligence, and counterinsurgency tactics. Indian forces in the same period demonstrated incredible grit and determination in fending off secessionist forces in Punjab and Jammu and Kashmir. As these memories fade and calls for deployment abroad intensify, it is crucial that India carefully consider the costs. It is useful for India to learn from China's rise. In the 1970s, it was pushing for a united front against the USSR on the diplomatic side of things. This stood in contrast to their reluctance to intervene, directly or indirectly, in the 1971 Indo-Pakistani War, despite Nixon strongly urging them to. What drove such a change was the need to free China's strategic space of the constraints imposed on it by the cooperative bond the US and USSR shared in the period. It used the Vietnam and Afghanistan conflicts to achieve this. In the process, it created a favorable political climate for the flow of Western investments. So much so that when Tiananmen happened, advocates for ties with China in these countries were able to mitigate damage to ties. The USSR's breakup meant that China had achieved its strategic objectives, and so it switched up its policy and began making up with a Russia that was seeing increasing pressure. So what exactly does an Indian take away from all this? A competitor that was willing to take greater risks and pursue strategic clarity gained a more favorable geopolitical balance and a decade's head start in economic growth. So much for consistency. The 1960s is called the dangerous decade because of the political uncertainty and national fragility that defined it. As such, this term can also be applied to the 1990s. The 1991 balance of payment crisis marked the culmination of all the policy outcomes the previous older generations were responsible for. Decades later, much of the literature on the events focused on the domestic challenges it induced. The foreign policy situation was just as traumatic. It took a lot of courage and creativity to chart a path to recovery. The USSR's collapse undermined a fundamental assumption Indian foreign policy operated off since 1971 and perhaps since 1955. What was worse is that the Russia that emerged from the ashes of the USSR was much more focused on the West and, for a brief passage of time, downgraded ties with India. The Indian response was quite mature. It engaged the US more intensively and reached out to China, all while maintaining the importance of Russia. The opening of the Indian economy to the world during this period was helpful in these endeavors. ASEAN played a critical role during this period by helping smoothen India's interactions with Asian economies and by serving as a new focus point for India's foreign policy, a foreign policy that was looking like it was about to be adrift. India's membership of the ASEAN Regional Forum as well as the growing partnership with the ASEAN countries were extremely important, even if the long-term implications were not fully appreciated at the time. It changed Indian thinking and led to the cultivation of ties with Japan and South Korea. This period of adjustment for Indian foreign policy enabled the country to operate on multiple axes in international affairs with comfort, something which you see even today. As you've probably observed already, this phase unfolded at a time when India was seeking a way out of a difficult predicament, a time when the foundations of its foreign policy were called into question. it nonetheless developed into a larger defense of India's strategic autonomy. Strategic autonomy being the ability of a country to pursue its preferred foreign policy without interference or being constrained from or by foreign actors. It is interesting to observe that real stress being applied to India's polity is what it took for the acquisition of clarity on what Indian red lines were, red lines being non-negotiables. A pressure point was the nuclear weapon option. India was faced with the challenge of developing it without causing an open confrontation. The framing of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty left India with little choice but to exercise its weapon option. Another challenge was safeguarding economic and developmental interests while facing down Western demands. Negotiations on TRIPS agreement and the Kyoto Protocol being examples. As this was happening, the worsening situation in Jammu and Kashmir became a domestic pressure point that added to the overall complexity of the situation. The attempt to internationalize this and fear of a shift in the long-standing US position on the issue caused considerable concern in India. The generation of leaders who resolved these issues with considerable finesse deserve praise. What helped resolve some challenges were long-pending course corrections such as upgrading relations with Israel. A combination of adjustments and initiatives saw India's position and economy visibly improve by the end of the decade. The nuclear tests of 1998 and the declaration of weaponization stand out in this time period due to the events decisively resolving a long-running dilemma and providing the attributes needed for a leading power. The delay of the nuclear option allowed Pakistan to briefly equalize, but the country's political and economic handicaps eventually diminished the value of this event. The Kargil conflict provided an opportunity to address the Pakistani challenge again while demonstrating a sense of responsibility. The spread of the internet economy helped create a new bond with the US and firmly established India in global circles as a tech power. The ascendancy of President Putin and the promise of Russia's revival concluded the century on a promising note for India. The world at the beginning of the 21st century was one seeing continued unipolarity even though signs of trouble were beginning to surface. The technology dominance of the US overshadowed the steady growth of emerging economies. It is perhaps this that contributed to the US underestimation of China's potential for rapid economic growth and incredible exploitation of trade opportunities. The Yugoslavian conflict once again provided an opportunity for Western powers to stamp their authority, done in complete ignorance of the long-term threats that were to hit them soon. India-US relations developed well during this period. Both nations sought to move past issues that constrained their growth. The experience of the Kargil War helped enhance confidence levels between the two countries, leading to the next steps in strategic partnership (NSSP) in 2004, an initiative that sought to address export control restrictions. The 2005 Indo-US nuclear deal makes this appear less bold in hindsight, but it provided a critical step in the attempt at achieving a larger breakthrough on the nuclear issue. While this was happening, there was a significant change in the global setting due to the September 11 attacks and the American return to Afghanistan. India handled this opportunity skillfully by positioning itself as a sympathetic and understanding partner willing to work to American comfort levels. In the US itself, the H-1B visa program saw the Indian community grow steadily and acquire the ability to make its interests felt in US politics. Terrorism and tech drove the Indo-US relationship and opened up new pathways of opportunity for India. In both these cases, it is important to recognize the Indian government's skill at seizing the opportunity just as much as the significance of the events themselves. India sought to balance its groundbreaking initiatives with the US by making progress in its relationship with other important players. One effort was the initiation of the Russia-India-China grouping that would go on to form the core of what we now know as BRICS. With China, India sought to improve the relationship with the 2003 Special Representatives Mechanism on Boundary Negotiations, followed by the 2005 Agreement on Political Parameters and Guiding Principles on the Boundary Issue. There was even serious talk of a free trade agreement with China. The TLDR explanation is that India tried to improve the relationship it had with China by creating structures to resolve the disputed border problem between the two countries. France was much more understanding of India's nuclear tests than most other countries. The relationship therefore intensified rapidly in the domains of defense, nuclear and space. Each of these trends continued for the next decade as India went about attempting to influence global outcomes. This relied on a stable balance based on the superiority of the US and other major powers offsetting its influence. As American dominance receded and China became more powerful, the change in landscape made old calculations difficult to practice. The 2005 Indo-US nuclear deal was a pretty important event due to the era in which it occurred, an era of the nuclear test, 9/11, Great War on Terror and Iraq. This is because the agreement removed key obstacles to the development of Indo-US ties and enabled the Indo-US relationship to reach the stage it has in the present. It played a role in shaping the global perception of India and helped elevate India's stature. Put simply, the deal set aside prohibitions on nuclear cooperation. This had a ripple effect on, quote, defense, on dual-use technology, and on space cooperation, end quote. Because the US made an exception for India with this deal, it substantially changed Indian sentiments on the US. For the Americans, the growing relevance of Asia was a key factor in striving for a stronger relationship with a democratic and market-oriented India. Debates on this issue in India revolve around the political suspicion of the US, implications for the nuclear weapon program, and pressures on the relationship with Iran. The agreement itself was radical in nature and involved extremely complicated negotiations due to the cooperation hinging on legislation. Despite this, India was able to achieve a successful outcome. It opened the road for India to be made an exception by the nuclear suppliers group. This helped in negating the perception of India being an aberration when it came to the nuclear domain. As the US was the world's foremost power, India's improved ties with the country put pressure on other countries to also improve their relationship with India. Immediate gains were observed as European powers and Russia were supportive for their own reasons. China's relationship with both the US and India were cooperative at that time, leading to its support of the NSG waiver decision. A few years later, global equations would change, producing different results. The nuclear deal underlined the gains of balancing. Its aftermath revealed the challenges of balancing. Balancing requires all major relationships to continue in a beneficial way at the same time. This allows one relationship to be used to make gains in the other. The moment they slow down, the relationships become a constraint on each other. In the case of Indo-US ties in 2005, the path for the nuclear deal was built through a defense framework, an open skies agreement, and strong business sentiment. Post-nuclear deal, the relationship lost steam. The handling of the civil nuclear liability issue, excessive defense expectations, and frictions on the trade side between the two countries being the main reasons. The Obama administration's approach to the Afghanistan-Pakistan theater and the controversy caused by the unjustified arrest of an Indian diplomat added another layer to the relationship that had become dominated by irritants. Minister Jaishankar, after arriving in the US in December 2013 as India's ambassador, found himself engaged in damage control rather than consolidating a breakthrough. The mood of the relationship changed only after a new government came to power in New Delhi. The lesson in all this is the importance of maintaining ties by both sides of the relationship. Balancing was a difficult exercise by 2014, and sour sentiments weren't the only factor. The global financial crisis of 2008-2009 had led to serious structural shifts. The election of Barack Obama created a sense of hope, but the withdrawal from Iraq and the promise to do so in Afghanistan meant the retrenchment of US power had begun. Retrenchment is the reduction in the extent or quantity of something. As time ticked on, it became obvious that the US no longer possessed the inclination to meet global challenges in the same way that it had in the past. This was most visible in the Asia Pacific. Minister Jaishankar states that as ambassador in Beijing after 2009, he witnessed firsthand the growing sense of confidence in the Chinese establishment about the pace of its rise. The change of guard in China ushered in a different era for China and its relations with the world. During this period, India's ties with China became more complex. Controversies over stapled visas, military contacts, and border intrusions foretold of a new phase. This phase or period was also when China's presence in India's immediate periphery became more visible. While there was speculation about a G2 between the US and China, the reality was that the US had less to offer and China had a greater ask. As these events unfolded, political change in India meant new factors being brought into play. By 2014, the global situation forced India to conceive its foreign policy goals differently. The country had to deal with greater multipolarity and uncertainty that characterized international affairs. Nations were coming together on narrower issues rather than broad approaches. In large part, the affairs of the world looked like a global marketplace that had fewer preconceptions and many transactions. It is in such a world that India set out to raise its global profile, consciously influence international gatherings and negotiations, purposefully increase high-level contacts, and ambitiously invest in building linkages and connectivity. Its primary objective was the consolidation of its position in Asia. In tandem, India also made an effort to think beyond Asia. Within Asia, the neighborhood came first, and the swearing in of 2014 sent a clear message of change in this regard. India became an advocate of positive regionalism, which it expressed through expanded commitments to connectivity and development projects. India acknowledged identity politics found purchase in its periphery, but calculated that structural linkages could compensate this in the longer run. Most of these countries being democratic meant pressures of election cycles and competitive politics, which had to be managed. In the present, Pakistan has been a challenge given its continuing practice of cross-border terrorism. This, combined with its resistance on the question of connectivity, puts it out of step with other countries of South Asia. India's more confident posture has been demonstrated in both a willingness to engage as well as retaliate. The dramatic prime ministerial visit to Lahore and cross-boundary strikes being examples. Pre-Taliban takeover, Afghanistan had been brought closer to India politically and psychologically. This seen in the implementation of the Chabahar port project and the provision of security assistance to the Afghan military. India's growing interests and aspirations means there is a stronger feel for the extended neighborhood, Southeast Asia, islands in the Indian Ocean, and the Gulf countries. India's Look East policy that centers on Southeast Asia has seen stronger project implementation focus and has become the Act East policy. This converges with the Government of India's determination in developing its Northeast Asian region as well as a push for greater access and connectivity in Bangladesh. As the presence of all ASEAN leaders at the Republic Day celebrations in 2018 shows, relations with Southeast Asia have acquired a greater security dimension and stronger political profile. Relations with the Gulf countries once focused mainly on energy and community. That narrow relationship has since broadened and has expanded to security and politics. This required dexterity due to the issues between Iran and the Gulf countries. With the Indian Ocean island nations, the Sagar Doctrine launched in March 2015 that takes an integrated approach to the maritime domain has helped create basis for cooperation. India has concluded white shipping agreements with 17 nations, provided 8 of them with coastal surveillance radars, 6 of them with naval capabilities, and set up an integrated fusion center for maritime domain awareness. It has extended soft lines of credit and deputed training teams to 11 nations in the field of defense, in addition to offering capacity building to a large number of foreign militaries. India's hydrographic cooperation includes 5 nations in the Indian Ocean, and its 3 annual HADR exercises have helped in undertaking 7 major operations in the past 5 years, stretching from Fiji to Yemen and Mozambique. In maritime policy, India could succeed in doing more with less. The impact of lighter footprint, applications of technology, embrace of partnerships, and a propensity towards frugality are now converging. The impact of this convergence is further intensified due to India working with international partners. Africa is now treated as the neighborhood that lies beyond the horizon. The October 2015 India-Africa Forum Summit saw the participation of all 54 nations, 41 of them at the leader level. India plans on opening new embassies in 18 African nations. Senior Indian leadership visits to Africa has increased. So too has the development assistance and training initiatives. Indian outreach to Latin America, the Caribbean, Pacific Islands and Oceania is also increasingly visible. Broader engagement will determine how much India can exploit these opportunities. Much like other major powers, India has begun seeing development partnerships as a powerful tool in its diplomatic toolkit. It has done this in its own unique India way. It has offered 300 lines of credit or LOCs to 64 countries spanning 540 projects. The bulk of the LOCs and projects are with Africa, 321 projects involving 205 LOCs. India has 181 projects in Asia, 32 in Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as 3 each in Central Asia and Oceania. The size of LOCs and the complexity of the projects have qualitatively expanded in recent years. The planning and execution has become more efficient due to a more integrated approach and stronger oversight. Grant assistance dispersal is even broader than LOCs. They virtually cover all developing regions of the world. In this regard, Africa is a particular focus of attention, at least partly as a result of Indian solidarity born out of a sense of shared struggles. That said, there also exists an aspect of strategy. This is because the rise of Africa will add to the multipolarity of the world. As other countries have discovered before India, these development partnerships provide the foundation for long-lasting relationships. Quote, Indian-supported projects cover the power sector in Sudan, Rwanda, Zimbabwe and Malawi, water in Mozambique, Tanzania and Guinea, health in Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea and Zambia, sugar plants in Ethiopia and Ghana, cement in Djibouti and Republic of Congo, and government buildings in Gambia and Burundi. End quote. In several African countries, some of the manufacturing plants India has set up are the first of their kind. Indian interests in Africa are growing. 51 of 44 countries of the continent host such development projects, while training collaboration covers 10,000 Africans annually. The E-Vidya Bharati Distance Education and E-Arogya Bharati Distance Health, 2 digital initiatives, are on a pilot mode. More than just the cooperation itself, this aspect of India's foreign policy highlights the country's progressive emergence on the global scale. The lessons of India's past can be understood as 5 separate baskets. The first basket deals with the need for greater realism in policy. In the face of optimistic non-alignment, perhaps even after, India's focus on diplomatic visibility, wanting to be seen on the world stage, led to the country overlooking the harsher realities of hard security. The misreading of Pakistan's intentions in its early years can be possibly explained away by the lack of experience, but hesitation in attaching overriding priority towards securing the border even after a decade had passed is a lot more difficult to justify. It is not that the challenges of 1962 were unanticipated. It is that a diplomacy focused on world politics was not given the primacy it deserved. There was, somewhere, an implicit yet deep-rooted idea that India's high standing in world affairs was enough to protect it against global turbulence and competitive politics. Therefore, it was at some cost that we as Indians eventually discovered that outcomes could be decided as much on the field as at conferences. This is a key takeaway for modern times, despite the world becoming ever more constrained. It is important to note that India did choose to apply force when required. Examples being Hyderabad in 1948, Goa in 1961, or Kashmir when attacked by Pakistan. However, because India had heavily invested in the image of a reluctant power, the country ended up influenced by this narrative. Due to this, India rarely prepared for security situations with the same sense of mission as our competitors. A discomfort with hard power was reflected in the 1962 war, more specifically in the lack of adequate consultation with the military during the war. The creation of the post of CDS, Chief of Defence Staff, over half a century later shows how far the country has travelled in this regard. It is worth studying the judgments of the past that overlooked security implications. An overemphasis on diplomacy led to a deficit in understanding the behavior of other countries. The Cold War was seen more as an argumentation rather than a ruthless exercise of power, which was its reality. In the 1950s, there was little awareness that India was dealing with a battle-hardened neighbor to the north. A similar lack of awareness also surrounded the strategic significance of Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. This mindset meant that in 1972 at Shimla, India bet on an optimistic outlook when it came to Pakistan. It resulted in Pakistan becoming more revanchist and problems in Jammu and Kashmir that continue to this day. That it has taken such a long time for India to link talks with the cessation of terrorism speaks to the state of the broader Indo-Pakistani dialogue. Quote, without overstating the argument, a case can certainly be made for a more grounded Indian approach to international relations. End quote. The second basket deals with the economic side of things. In all major growth stories of the post-1945 world, the focus on leveraging the global environment for national development is a common feature. China did this first with the USSR and then with the US and the West. The Asian tiger economies did it with Japan, the US, and now are doing it with China. India approached its various relationships over the last 7 decades in much the same way, just without the single-mindedness on most occasions. Despite this, India owes much of its industrialization and capacities in other domains to collaborations enabled by diplomacy. Examples being steel, nuclear industry, higher education, and computing. This also holds true for the post-1991 reform period and the eastward shift of India's economic center of gravity. The interconnection between diplomacy, strategy, and economic capabilities is not always obvious. Just as we do in the realm of security, it is important to note the difference between cause and effect. It is the economy that drives diplomacy, not the other way around. India benefited from the reforms of the 1990s that saw greater openness. That was then extrapolated onto free trade agreements with Southeast and East Asia, which eventually made the whole proposition much more challenging. This could be blamed on everything from structural rigidities, limited competitiveness, inadequate exploitation of opportunities, to simple unfair practices. It does little to change the stark reality of growing deficit numbers. Their negative impact on Indian industry is impossible to deny. And of course, China poses a special challenge when it comes to trade, even without an FTA. Maximizing options and expanding space available requires engaging multiple players. This is the third basket. Since there is consensus about nurturing Indian independence within Indian foreign policy, this basket is a given, at least at the conceptual level. In the first decade of the bipolar world, India did well for itself, but also discovered the dangers that came with it, of being left short on all accounts. As 1962 showed, the best of both worlds is easier to imagine than realize. In the periods that followed, the distance India kept from one pole or power center was not automatically compensated by proximity to the other. Sometimes, like in 1971, circumstances required India to lean on one side, much the same way China itself had in 1950 and 1971. Extracting more from the international system depends on the bigger picture. It cannot be assumed that the game being played is a zero-sum game. A disturbing scenario that nations like India and China faced in the 1960s was the prospect of the world's two superpowers finding common ground. This is why, even decades later, talk of a G2 created deep unease in so many quarters. Quote, hedging is a delicate exercise. Whether it is the non-alignment and strategic autonomy of earlier periods or multiple engagements of the future. But there is no getting away from it in a multipolar world. This is a game best played on the front foot, appreciating that progress on any one front strengthens that on all others. End quote. To the old-fashioned and uninitiated, the pursuit of approaches that are seemingly contradictory may be baffling. How do you reconcile a Howdy Modi gathering with a Vladivostok summit, RIC, Russia, India, China, with a JAI, Japan, America, India, Quad and the SCO, Iran with the Saudis or Israel with Palestine? It is by looking beyond dogma and entering the quote-unquote real world of convergences. It is better thought of as calculus rather than simple arithmetic. This new version of world affairs must be mastered by practitioners and analysts alike if they wish to forge ahead in the world. Risk-taking is inherent to diplomacy. Most policy judgments revolve around its mechanics. Hedging is its natural companion. The fourth basket, therefore, is understanding that low-risk foreign policy is likely to produce limited rewards. For India, some risks paid off while some didn't when it adopted a riskier approach. A broad approach was laid out as early as 1946, which was developed over time. India was put under pressure in 1962 and 1971, but it limited the compromises that it had to make and sought to revert to the earlier posture as and when it could. As India rose, it introduced new concepts and terms to deal with emerging issues without discarding earlier ones. India thus preferred a steady and middle-of-the-road approach, an approach that gathered greater substance as the country's influence grew. This being noted, the truth is that moving up the global ladder required taking big calls, conventional or nuclear, political or economic. Not every risk is dramatic. It may merely require confident calculations and determined follow-through of day-to-day policy management. Over time, this can result in a quantum leap for India in terms of global positioning. To a degree, this is already observable. The fifth basket is reading the global tea leaves right. All nations find their foreign policy set in the backdrop of global contradictions, a reflection of an assessment of opportunities and compulsions, risks and rewards. Even if one were to correctly assess its immediate situation, a misreading of the larger landscape could prove costly. In India's case, approaching the UN on Jammu and Kashmir was a misreading of the intent of the Anglo-American alliance and the seriousness of the Cold War. An awareness of the growing Sino-Soviet differences did not mature according to India's expected timeline. India did have its successes. The Indo-Soviet and present Indo-Russian relations are a direct result of Indian global strategizing. India's adjustment of its US policy post-1991 is another example. The Indo-Soviet Treaty and the India-US nuclear deal were outcomes of a larger reading of world affairs. This also holds for the correctives India introduced with the US in 1973 and China in 1976 in order to overcome the polarization caused by 1971. Identifying opportunities tossed up by the structure of world politics can help mitigate risks. France, after the 1998 nuclear tests, is an example. An appreciation of world politics today must include a proper understanding of Sino-US contradictions, growing multipolarity, weaker multilateralism, larger economic and political rebalancing, greater space for regional powers, and of a world of convergences. Each of these is a factor when it comes to driving policy initiatives in the current era. They represent an aspect of a greater repositioning, be it in Indian outreach to the Gulf, advocacy of Indo-Pacific, or a more vigorous engagement of Europe. A world that is changing has practical values for those who do not wish to be left behind. It requires a thought process that is in keeping with the times, a clear definition of interests, and its determined pursuit. This is seen in India's appreciation of its maritime geography and its Sagar doctrine. When confronted by security challenges, this India has responded with newfound grit. Enthusiasm when it comes to influencing global conversations on climate change, terrorism, connectivity, and maritime security is already having an impact. Statements of its capability and responsibility are echoed in the relief operations undertaken in Yemen, Nepal, Iraq, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Fiji, and Mozambique. So too is its election-winning record in international organizations. Improved project execution now accompanies expanded offers of development assistance. the neighborhood and Africa being examples. India's branding has become stronger as seen through the International Day of Yoga, the International Solar Alliance, or the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. It is hard to categorize the current phase of foreign policy. This is partly because India is in the early phase of a major transition. The outline of the near future is not yet clear. One solution is tying the future to Indian aspirations and speak of India's goal as an emerging or leading power. The issue is that many see this as a statement of arrival rather than a goal to be achieved. It is useful to speak of multi-alignment rather than just non-alignment, given that it makes India appear more energetic and participative. The issue is that this appears opportunistic when India is really seeking strategic convergence over tactical convenience. Talking of India first may be a way of capturing the country's strong and pragmatic policy outlook, but it suffers from comparisons with other nations who have chosen a more self-centered path. Indian nationalism has led to greater internationalism after all. Advancing prosperity and influence is a fair description, but isn't exactly catchy. Quote, "Perhaps we need to accept that a single phrase may elude us for some time in the midst of global uncertainty." End quote. Whether India lost valuable time in moving to the next level is a query rooted in hindsight that may lack context. Nevertheless, this is something that can be contemplated upon when looking at the outcomes of judgments rather than the circumstances. Quote, "Should India, for example, have brought the boundary issue to a head in 1950 itself? Could the border conflict of 1962 have been avoided by a compromise in 1960 when Zhou Enlai came to India? With the US, did a cultural antipathy in the initial years aggravate the sense of distance?" End quote. On the economic front, there is some consensus that India should have opened up a decade before it actually did, like ASEAN or China. On the strategic front, delaying the process of becoming a nuclear weapon power from 1974 to 1998 was unhelpful. So too was India's handling of Pakistan. These examples are being cited to underline the argument that emergence as a leading power requires great pragmatism, something that can be strengthened by sophisticated narratives that help reconcile divergences. After all, India's emphasis on sovereignty has not prevented it from responding to human rights situations in its immediate neighborhood. The steps India took to ensure its integrity and promote regional security in Hyderabad, Goa, Sri Lanka or Maldives have not made it any less multilateral. Well-established views are the strongest when it comes to long-standing and continuing challenges, Pakistan being the best example of this. A change in thinking triggers debate, as has been the case for the past few years. India allowed the narrative to focus mainly on dialogue when the real issue was and is stopping cross-border terrorism. Quote, "Dogma treats every new approach as an unjustified deviation." End quote. Over the past few years, however, global conversations on cross-border terrorism have become a lot more serious and a different normal has developed. Talk of internationalization when it comes to combining separatism in Jammu and Kashmir as well as the hyphenation of India with Pakistan is thinking from the past. It does not reflect the strength of India, the mood of the nation, or the determination of the government. Uninformed comments made abroad is hardly internationalization. The reputational and real differences between India and Pakistan also puts to rest any hyphenation effort. Quote, "In reality, these fears are but a thinly disguised advocacy of inaction. Their intent, conscious or otherwise, is to legitimize a status quo that has now been overtaken by history." End quote. After 7 decades, India's foreign policy balance sheet presents a mixed picture. While there has been significant progress when it comes to national development, more is needed. Reading the big picture correctly and operating in the international arena could have been done better. A mantra of unchanging foreign policy axioms has detracted from an honest review of performance and the timely introduction of correctives. For an aspiring player, diligence and debate have not been as rigorous as they should have been. When combined with the hesitations of history, it has led to unexplored paths and unrealized outcomes. As always, I leave you with the minister's words. Quote, "We are now at the cusp of change. With more confidence, the pursuit of seemingly divergent goals and the straddling of contradictions are being attempted. Taking risks is inherent to the realization of ambitions. A nation that has the aspiration to become a leading power someday cannot continue with unsettled borders, an unintegrated region, and underexploited opportunities. Above all, it cannot be dogmatic in approaching a changing global order. The world that awaits us not only calls for fresh thinking, but eventually a new consensus as well. Putting dogmas behind us is a starting point for that journey." End quote. Well, that's all folks. Thank you for taking the time to see another one of my videos. Please don't forget to hit like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.